I made this DVD, Cattle Stories and Bush Yarns, back in 2009, but all the interviews were done in 2007-2008. It was an idea of Fred Wilson's. Fred and his father before him had been livestock transporters. The old days of driving stock to local sale yards and from there to their final destinations had long gone, as had the sale yards. A whole way of life was fading from human memory. So we set about tapping those memories that still existed, memories in some cases going back to the 1930s. We sold a few hundred copies on DVD, but I thought it would be worth a run on YouTube.
310, 3310, 4, 34 pound, at 34 outside, at 34 pound, at 34 pound, hold on, at 34 pound, 33 pound 11 is the bid, at 33 pound 11, 33 pound 11 they go, hold on, all finished, Jack Price wins them, Jack Price from Dennis Haywood, thank you very much, Jack.
What I liked about the stock agent's job was meeting people.
A lot of skullduggery too.
They could drag money out of the sky, a whole lot of them.
When the first European settlers arrived in the Western District of Victoria, they pastured their stock on the clearer country of the coastal fringe.
This land here was semi-clear and rather grassy, whereas country inland had big timber on it. It was hard to clear, no bulldozers, all had to be done by hand. So this country along here, right from Bridgewater to Nelson, was all taken up first because it was already clear.
Later on, the forest was also used for grazing stock.
The bush was very open. They used to graze it, you see, and a lot of native grass, or silver grass, and a lot of bush grass.
Graziers leased large areas of heath and forest country. Each lease in the Cobbobony Forest was originally identified by a letter of the alphabet. The T and W road bordering leases T and W is a surviving reminder. However, these runs, as they were known, inevitably took on the names of the lessees. There was O'Halloran's Run, Hanlon's, Brucknell's, and so on. Fire was the bush grazier's only management tool.
Out the back of our property we had 3 big swamps, and they were naturally clear. There was nothing on them, and I believe the old hands used to fatten the bullocks out here in the wet time. And I know even one of the old hands used to run his cattle out here because all this was burnt. As soon as it got too dense, and to get the feed in you had to burn it. And it was called McGuinness's Run.
They used to have a run here known as Halloran's Run. And I think if you searched the bush in 1 or 2 places, you would still find the remains of an old fence. It was fenced, the runs were fenced.
While many settled near the coast, others ventured further inland. The explorer Major Mitchell, having set out from Sydney en route for the south coast, discovered good grazing land in the area of Hamilton and Casterton, which he named Australia Felix. He informed the Hentys of this on his arrival at Portland Bay in 1836. The Hentys wasted little time in driving their flocks to settle the rich grazing land between Merino and Casterton, displacing the traditional owners in the process.
Francis Henty and Edward Henty, along with some of my ancestors, had selected land at Merino and at Muntham, which is halfway between Coleraine and Casterton.
In the early days, stock sales were held in the paddock, but gradually sale yards were established strategically throughout the district, amounting to at least a dozen at one time. The earliest photo we have of a sale is this one taken in 1912 of sale day at the Kentbruck Hotel, which was situated at the corner of the Kentbruck and Portland Nelson Roads. Other districts in the Shire which had sale yards at various times included Bridgewater, Mount Richmond, North Portland, Narrawong, Tirrandarra, Conda, Dartmoor, Lyons, Merino, Digby, Coleraine, Casterton, and for 100 years, Haywood was a major selling centre.
There was, I think, a sale about every fortnight, perhaps a month in Haywood. The yards, the old yards, were in the centre of the town, behind the small supermarket and where Jack Dowling used to live in Scott Street. There was big yards there. And they were fairly big yards, sheep and cattle.
I started working with Claude Moore at the Haywood Sale Yards here in Cameron Street. He was at Ennie's agent, he was at Lascelles' agent when he came back after the war, and he used to ask me to come in and help him when I was a kid still at school.
A pretty smart boy, Frank. Very clever with figures. He was wonderful with figures.
Well, mainly drafting the cattle. Those times, of course, the cattle were driven to the sale yards, they weren't trucked in. No paperwork or anything of those times, of course. There would be very few cattle brought into the yards the day before. You'd meet them the morning of the sale, help them get them into the yards and then sort them up and get them ready to put through the sale ring. It was ring selling, of course, those times. There usually was an auctioneer who'd come down from Hamilton to sell the cattle, and then they were sold, they put back in the pens, and then, of course, delivered after the sale. People would come and pick them up, or they'd be, in the case where we used to take them to Borthwick's, they'd be put in a yard ready to go next morning. Keith Lanyon was the auctioneer here for a long, long time. He used to come down from Hamilton, well-respected, well-known auctioneer, one of probably the best in the district at those times. Jack Price started not long after that. Goffey Thomas, I think, took it on after Claude Moore. Vic Wright, of course, was an agent for a long time in Haywood. And everybody knows Vic, I think. I worked for Vic for a long while.
I was at several Bridgewater sales. It was just up from the cemetery. Yeah, just up from the cemetery. And they were fairly big sales too. Well, of course, Wilson cattle. Tommy Wilson died. There was young Tom. Reg that had Sinclair, just up here. Old Jim. And I was named after one that was killed off a horse, Sid Wilson. The people would arrive, the vendors, and there's always, of course, at the sale, there's 2 or 3 bidders and 50 looker-ons. I think it's the same today. But they'd arrive, there was a tent with a cup of tea and sandwich and that the ladies, I think, used to run.
Out at Bridgewater, I got a cup of tea, and the cup had a crack in it like that. And my mother taught us at home never to drink out of a cup that had a crack in it. And here I'm holding, and I thought, well, what the hell am I going to do? So at last I just went like that, and it fell down there, and I jumped my foot on it, and that was it. Went back and got another cup.
It was a real day out for everybody. There were people there from all around the district. A big day, talk till dark.
In the mid-30s, a firm called Campbell and Malseed from Mount Gambier, they came into the picture. And Percy Campbell, Mount Gambier, was my dad's cousin. And my dad was his representative here, and he organised a lot of the sales here in the late 30s.
And I remember the old yards, they were the old style split rail yards, split post, mortised in. A lot of work went into it. And good cattle, a lot better cattle than what we see now. There were predominantly Hereford.
Sam Kennedy was an old timer. Like a lot of us, he was reared on horses. It was the only mode of transport. I don't know why I met him down at the sale yards one day, but I met him there, and the first thing Sam had to do was boil a billy and have a drink out of his quart pot, and I suppose it was traditional, yeah.
K.P. Lanyon was the last auctioneer that I remember there. We were all there, the last sale that was held there. What year it was, I don't know, but Keith was the auctioneer, Frank was the bookkeeper, and I was the rouseabout at that sale yards. It'd be a full day's episode for some. They'd probably never, Bugleholes were another family that would be there. They'd probably only leave Bridgewater once a year to go to Portland, and that was a big day there, the sale at Bridgewater. Pity it fell down now, there's not much of the yards left.
The last sale was held at the Bridgewater Yards in 1965. However, a special horse sale and a cattle sale were held on the Kennedy family property in 1975. Auctioneers were a vital cog in the stock selling machine. The wit and repartee of the best of them was legendary.
The best auctioneer, in my opinion, there were three. Keith Lanyon from Hamilton started his days with Brock and Co in Casterton, and went to different companies and eventually became his own company, KP Lanyon and Co. Jack Ellis, I dare say there was no better than Jack Ellis, and a fellow called Maurice Stansmore that came into the area with Australian Estates. He was a beauty, and they could drag money out of the sky, the whole lot of them.
A lot of skullduggery too, one way or another, running cattle and all that sort of thing. They'd buy cattle somewhere or another, and they'd bring them down, say, to Hayward, and they'd be up there, and they'd get a bidder, and they'd bid against him, you know. Run the cattle. Oh hell, any amount of fellas have taken cattle to the sale and sheep, and there've only been two buyers, the owner and the fellow who wanted them. They had plenty of time.
Billy Hewitt, he was a funny old fella from Hamilton. He used to get obstropolous if you didn't bid properly. A good old bloke though, Billy. Good old fella.
I recall saying to Keith Lanyon one day, you follow the trots, you ought to have a cart on yourself, you're the best trotter I know. He says, yes, and he says, if I'm selling for you, I'm trying to extract the most I can get, and I don't give a damn how you pay for what you've bought.
Mount Richmond sale yards, yes, they were built after the war by Sim Johnson, I understand. It was Sim Johnson, split the rails, beautiful split rails was in the... They didn't operate for a great while.
Oh, well, Mount Richmond sale day before the sale, we'd be about a week mustering, and then when sale day come, of course, it was, all the cattle was divided out into lots, and those days they never had swinging gates, we all had rails in each yard to pen them off.
They did have some very good cattle, such as those that have been breeding for a number of years, such as Tom Emerson from Bridgewater, but he also had a property at Grey West, and Robbie Little. Both those people had beautiful Hereford cattle in those days, and they were in the first two yards to give the yard a bit of it. Tommy Wilson, which used to run the cattle out here, and he had a property further up on the coast. He used to bring quite a few down, he just walked them down to the yards.
The auctioneers and the agents used to come for miles to there, and of course after the sale they'd get let out into individual paddocks.
Sometimes they used to drive the cattle through to Hayward and truck them from there. A few years later on, it was both Bob Blacker and his son John had the transports, and they had international trucks and fairly double-deckers, and single-deckers for cattle, of course. And they used to cart quite a few of the cattle away from Mount Richmond sales.
Oh, well, the biggest character would be Jim Johnson, I think, would be about the biggest. He always seemed to put on a good show, and he was such a big man, and everything that he did, he made fun of himself as well as everything else, and it was, yeah, quite happy. He'd always make some fun out of something. No matter what, if the day was dull, well, he'd make a happy-go-lucky atmosphere. Vicky Wright used to be always there, and he used to be able to rope them, and he'd always do a day's roping or something like that, just for a lark.
The Mount Richmond ladies put on afternoon tea, and there used to be quite a gathering. I wouldn't know just how many. If I said about 40 or 50 people would tend up, I probably wouldn't be exaggerating. There could even have been more. I know nearly all the locals used to turn up. They used to boil water for the afternoon tea in a copper, which was cleaned, And the ladies would cook the various things for the afternoon tea, including cakes and scones and plain scones and jam and cream on them. And yeah, they used to do a very, very good job of it. It was excellent.
Yeah, North Portland had a Gaylard Day too. There'd be all the locals from miles around. Australian Estates, I think, there too, started there. They were built by, or as far as I can remember, the late Jack Thompson. And Estates run it, and then Southern Farmers took it over, I think, after a time. But it didn't last very long, not many years really, that the sale was run there. A lot of the cattle there came from close around. There were quite a few dairy farmers around there. There was a lot of dairy cattle, you know, chopper cows and things went through there. There were some good cattle as well.
We invited Fred Wilson, a second-generation livestock carrier, and Brian O'Halloran, a second-generation stock agent, along to the Haywood Pioneer Wagon Museum to reflect on earlier times. We apologise for the starling chicks in the roof.
I remember being at North Portland one day, and there was a chap, Sadler, from, I can't think of his team, Ken Sadler, from Sale. He was there. Well, he laid his ears back, and didn't he buy? And he bought everything. And he knocked all the meat buyers out and everything else. How he ever got out of it, must have been a good season in Gippsland, I gather, and he was taken down there, obviously to punt. He was a well-known punter. Punter, they called them. Cattle dealer is the right expression, but they were generally referred to as punters.
Probably as big a dealers that were ever around here in my time would have been Bullocks and Hamilton. Oh, they bought a lot of cattle. You know, go to a sale and buy 100 here today and 100 tomorrow. Where their outlet was, I don't know, where they sold.
While some people considered dealers to be gamblers and opportunists, others saw them as being a positive benefit to the small farmer.
In those days, people could go to Mount Richmond and they'd buy cattle. People didn't want to truck them, or those smaller centres, they'd buy the cattle and they could truck them out to Hamilton or Warrnambool or Mount Gambier, and they'd put together lines and they'd make a bit of profit out of them. Because in those days we didn't have the communications we've got today. The punters could make money because not everybody was so well informed about market prices. The blokes that were in the know or had orders, they could go out to the smaller centres and put cattle together and buy them and know they could make a profit. And that's how the punters or the dealers got into business.
There was quite a mixture of cattle that would be yarded at those sales, like Mount Richmond and Cape Bridgewater, North Portland, for example. There'd be everything from the skinniest old Jersey cow right through to an odd big bullock had come in, or a couple of bulls, and as a consequence you couldn't get necessarily a lot of good trade buyers there, so that the dealers in those were very beneficial to those centres, those small centres, and they in turn would they could put together a truckload because they'd buy anything. And it wasn't unusual for Frank and Keith Bullock to come, although Keith mainly attended the major sales. Frank would go to these smaller sales where Keith wasn't going to be, because although they were brothers, they didn't.
They were.
They weren't great friends.
They'd stand up there and bid against each other all day, wouldn't they, Brian? They wouldn't be shaking hands to say, well, I'll let you have this one, I'll get the next one. No way.
And they'd never travel together. It was always surprising to see them coming in from different directions to the Haywood yards or any sale. And if Frank wanted something, he had to bid for it against Keith.
Bullocks knew they knew their stock, you know, and they knew where to place them apparently. But a few arguments around the sale yards, disputed bids, that was my bid and that sort of thing, and so forth, etc. But then they were put up to be bid on again. And before every sale, I don't know whether it's now or not, they used to read out the rules of sale. It was like a few pages out of the Bible, what you could do and what you couldn't do and so forth, etc. But that sale day, that was a big day for everybody concerned.
Prior to the introduction of stock trucks in the late 1940s and early 50s, all stock were walked to and from sale yards. those destined for long distances were trucked by rail. Droving was a full-time occupation for many people, and a lot of them started very young.
We know I was reared at Lyons, and between working around home and in a bit of timber as a kid, I'm talking about now, and from say 10-year-old, from about 12-year-old, my father was a cattle dealer, not a very successful one, but he, I'd have to get a note from Mum to get away from school to drive cattle to Hayward from about 11, 12-year-old. There was no transports in those days, none whatever. They were all driven or trucked by rail.
I can go back to when I was 12 years old, droving cattle without supervision. I was the head drover. And we used to go as far as Mount Gambier. We used to go quite often to Nelson. We went as far as Codrington and places like that, in and out from Portland, droving livestock, yeah, no problem. Didn't have cars to worry about in those days, yes.
As far back as I can remember, we were droving cattle, and I got to like driving cattle, and I became the head drover. And I know I was about 14, and my young sister was about 9, and we were taking cattle to Mount Deception from Drumborg. And once we got into the forest, the Cobobony, the steer kept breaking, and I'd gallop him out and back, and then he flopped down like an emu, wouldn't get up. So I lit a fire beside him, and the fire crept closer and closer, and he was edging away, and last he jumped up and joined the mob. The fire went on and burnt 200 acres of scrub, and went out because it burnt onto another patch that had been burnt previously. So we got the cattle into the yard, and we headed for the bush, came home a different way, and we didn't hear any more about the fire. But it was very touch and go those days, because the ranger wanted to know what was going on if a fire went up, without authority.
The drive from Coleraine to Portland would be a 4 days duration. We took the drover's wagon when we had a fairly big mob where we were likely to run into trouble with weather and that sort of thing to get there. The procedure was that Coleraine to Hillman's Lane at Tahara the first night. Second night was to Conda Sale Yards behind the pub. Third night was to the Hayward, where the last set of sale yards were at Hayward that were closed down in recent times. And the last day, early rise and to the paddocks at Alice Street. Drop the cattle off, draft off what had to be put into the various paddocks, and turn round and ride the horse back to Coleraine during the night. It was a 8 to 10 hours ride, depending which horse I was riding. But in latter years I had my own horse, and he was exceptionally good to ride a distance, and I could get home within 8 hours.
But those old fellas would start off with a mob from Tirrandara, the Wilsons from Tirrandara to go to Sale and Cass, and they'd camp out, light a fire in a log, and they'd sleep there beside the fire for the night. And old Mr. Donald Ferguson, he did a lot of it. He had country at Strathdowney. And I thought this might have been interesting. He'd be shifting sheep from Lisnavar, which is now Lower Crawford at Lyons, to Strathdowney, and there would be weak sheep and strong sheep and one thing, and he'd put a little hurdle out of across the gate, a little hurdle, and open the gate, and the sheep would go, and Every sheep that jumped the gate, it went on the track, but the sheep that was too weak to jump the gate was put aside, and he had a stronger mob to go to Strathdownie.
Yeah, that was a good idea.
Yes, I thought it was, but they're those old fellas very cluey in their job, no doubt about that. Great people too.
We did walk sheep from Casterton sale yards here, the sheep that I bought. Dick Smith and his crew walked sheep to Portland on quite a few occasions. But then prior to that too, I didn't mention, but before my time, out of Mount Gambier, they used to walk lambs from Mount Gambier to Portland. It's pretty hard to believe, but it definitely happened. And they used to walk them out through Strathdownie and then across the bridge at Dartmoor and down that way. There was one time when Nils Kingdon bought about 5,000 lambs from Mount Shank Station from Mr. Trevor Clark. And they were going to walk, they decided they'd walk those to Portland through Nelson. Well, the old Nelson Bridge, for those that remembered it, were very narrow and wooden and rattly. And I think they were about 2 days trying to get the mob over the bridge. This was about 1940. I had 700 cattle headed to Borthwick's, mainly reject cull dairy cows. Hayward had just then designed a stock route round the back of the town, over the bridge, over the Fitzroy, turn sharp right and go round a block with one man on one horse, one dog and 700 cattle. There wasn't much hope of doing that, so I went straight up the highway towards Portland, and needless to say, the cattle left a little bit of droppings on the street, and about 9:30 in the morning I got down towards Portland as far as the Surrey River, and Bill Pevitt, the Shire Bylaws Inspector, caught up with me.
In 1940, I heard my dad talk about this one in 1940, the year of the Australian strike, I reckon it was 48. 48, the Australian strike. They walked all the cattle from Caston sale yard to one fella bought and took them to Newmarket, walked them to Newmarket.
All the way?
All the way, and then back in early 60s, 58s, there used to be people from Colac, Conna, used to buy a lot of cattle out here, and me and my dad used to walk them to Conna from here. When I was only a baby then, I was only in the pusher with my mum and my dad. So they were the old days.
I took a mob of cattle from Tarrandara to Melbourne to Newmarket, and we slept under the stars, me horse and all. That was the year in 1946, the year of the floods.
I left school in 1948 at 14, and one of the first jobs I did was to drive cattle to Borthwick's, Tom Rundle and myself. And we'd leave Hayward sale yards here daylight, we'd be down in Portland about at 10:30 or 11 with 70 to 100 head of cattle. And it mightn't seem very much now, but $2.50 we used to get for the trip, or I used to get. And on a horse with a couple of dogs and your dinner in the saddlebag, we reckon we made a week's wages. There was a bulldoze line down part of the way. Some of the way you'd come out onto the road, but the traffic respected you those times, or respected stock. They expected to see horses or cattle, and you never had to have signs or hazard lights, of course, or anything like that. We didn't have a lot of trouble. You had one man in the front on a horse and another one at the back bring them along. It used to take us about 4 or 5 hours to go to Portland.
There were two classes of drovers in the 30s and 40s, and up to early 1960, the drovers were classed on wagon men. They were the chaps that had the horse and cart and took mobs big distances. And then there was the saddlemen that used to do the local from farm to sale yards and from sale yards to paddocks and various close handy towns. They were what they called the saddlemen, and Some even called them the lightning drovers, because the quicker you got there, the better you were paid.
Well, you see people come out of New South Wales, they'd buy 400 litre cattle here, and my dad would take them on the road, and then 3 months down the track, they truck them back out to Queensland, like out to get the heads to go into the feedlots. Like, but them days are all gone. Them you don't see any of that anymore.
I wasn't a good horseman. My brother Bob was a better horseman. But Sam Kennedy, he'd be a really good horseman. I think Bob Black was a fairly good horseman. They were all horsemen. Some were better than others. That's as simple as it goes, yes.
Well, there was horsemen and cowboys. The really good horsemen, there was plenty of them about. There was the Bullocks in Hamilton, and the old fella from Brang's home, probably the best of the lot, Joey Atkinson. But they loved the buck jumpers, you know. Sam Mossy never had a horse that anybody else could ride. He was the only one who could ride it, because if it didn't buck, it was no good to him. You know, he was... but he was a good horseman. He served a lot of time in the Northern Territory. He one time was head stockman on Victoria River Downs, and he was in the Gulf country. He knew stock and that sort of thing, but he had to go about it in a cowboy way, whereas the likes of old Donald Ferguson off Lower Crawford, poking about on a very quiet little old horse with a wonderful dog, like he was a better stockman.
Well, a good stock horse was a natural horse. He was either born to be a stock horse or he wasn't. They'd breed cattle, they were like dogs. They didn't take a lot of education. A horse that was a good stock horse would be natural. Others wouldn't even make a kid's pony. They were that dense. It was a knowledge bred with them, and there were certain properties that you could go to and buy a horse off or get a horse off that was a natural stock horse. Myrndal was one place. You could go to Myrndal. They bred some very good horses. Majority of the horses that came off Myrndal, you could more or less throw a saddle at them, forget about the reins. They'd do the stock work. All you had to do was sit aboard.
Tom Wilson Jr. He lost his nerve. He could ride horses, and he still rode horses, but he'd lost his nerve, couldn't get on a young one. And he got in touch with me at Drumborg and asked if he could bring the horse over to Drumborg for me to ride. He'd lead it over. And I said, well, when are you going up to the Good Hill again? They owned the Good Hill on... Oh, he said, well, such and such a day. Well, I said, I'll be out there working, be camped there. Lead your horse there and I'll ride him for you. But there were no yards at Mount Deception. Not in our time, we didn't have a cattle yard there. And so Tom turned up, and of course the horse had come a fair way there, and he had the steam knocked out of him a bit. But I saddled him up, and he put his head down between his legs and did a few twists and bucked and took off. And I headed him straight up this mount, and by the time he got halfway up there, he had blown. So I turned him round and brought him back. I said, there you are, Tom. And I said, you better get on and ride him. No, he said, I won't. He said, I'll lead him home again into the yard before I get on him. Yes.
Vic Wright, a great identity. Wally Cameron and myself and Vic met up Claude Moore's farm at Drumborg to drench some sheep. And while we were there, we were on horses, rode horses up, and we took the drench up on the horses and so forth to do this. And when we was there, Vic said he could bulldog a steer. So we got Wally Cameron and I to haze and wing this steer along, and Vic galloped along on the horse of John Linden's to bulldog this steer. And when he dived down to bulldog the steer, he missed him. And he fell over in the grass, and the horse stood on him. And when we came back to see if he was all right, he just looked up, he said, did that bloody horse mean that?
Oh yes, that's another story. My father sent me out to Mount Deception. There were cows and calves and other stock running there, and he said, now leave the calves there and bring the cows home. 25. Well, I got the cows out the gate, but then I couldn't get them away from the fence because the calves were there, and up and down, no, couldn't get them. So I unlocked the gate again and galloped the calves right up over the hill out of sight, galloped back, and I was able to get the cows off the fence, and I got them home. Through the mountain, through the, just on 3 miles of the Kabobony, rough country. You wouldn't see far into the bush if you looked that way. It was plenty thick enough. Yeah. And of course those days there weren't the gravel roads through the forest. They came later. All there were log hauling tracks here and there.
Competition among horsemen manifested itself in organised rodeos. Many will have pleasant memories of the New Year's Day sports and rodeo on the beach at Cape Bridgewater. For a few years, other events were held at Haywood, Drumborg and Dartmoor. The Bridgewater event began as a picnic day with foot running and novelty events.
Well, as long as I can remember, we used to go to Bridgewater Sports Days, and it was a day out for the kids. But I do remember they had an old buffers race there one day, and I was surprised to see my father in his early 40s running in this race. There was absolutely no facilities over there at all. It was just the beach, and I suppose the mothers took afternoon tea, and I don't know whether we got lollies as trophies or not. I can't remember that far back, but it was a day out every year.
It was not till the late 1940s that a rodeo was incorporated into the program, with stock supplied by local farmers.
Every New Year's Day, we'd help and put the yards up. All the blokes around had land, they'd all get down and do the sports and supply the steers and everything for buck jumping and horses. Yeah, we used to have them in our paddock, the steers and everything after the day. But, oh no, on the beach we used to have the buck jumping. It was easy to fall then days in the sand.
So they put me on this Aberdeen Angus. Oh, he was a wild sod too. But he dumped me and kicked me fair in the nose. Yeah. Anyway, a doctor happened to be there. And he got a hole in my nose and he screwed it. Oh, he said, it's not broken. It felt as though it was.
Oh, that was a circus. That was a bullock ride. They used to put them in the chutes, let them go on the beach, and they'd buck out into the sea. And if you didn't get off quick and in the right manner, you finished up bathed. Yes, I judged at Bridgewater a couple of times. But she was a real day out, New Year's Day at Bridgewater.
Due to concerns about stock getting loose in the crowd, the last few rodeos were held in what was known as the old pub paddock, opposite the beach. The event struggled along in various forms till finally being abandoned about 1985. An annual rodeo was held at Haywood in the late 1940s and early 50s.
I had a rodeo here one year in Haywood for the Haywood Hospital. I forget how many £1,000 now we got for that to start the hospital off. We had a big day. There was buck jump riders from Queensland, about 7 of them, come down.
A lot of work putting things together to run a rodeo, but my brother and I were very keen, and a lot of other young fellas were keen, and we built yards there and had on the Haywood Oval, and built the yards there, and got stock. Anyway, it looked as though I was going to ride my horse, and I got out about 50 yards, but he dropped his shoulder. By hell, I went straight down there. Yeah, there's an old hand at it. But the roping, I could rope. I could throw a rope, yes. Catch a beast with the horns or the neck or the hind leg without any trouble.
In more recent years, an annual rodeo has been held at Tirrandara each January, organised by the football club, with stock and facilities supplied by Ron Woodall.
He's facing shoot number 2, Brendan Jackson, Tokyo goal. Yeah.
In earlier times, coastal land lacked trace elements. Cattle needed to be moved inland for part of the year if they were to thrive. Alternatively, inland cattle benefited from a few months on the coast.
But most of my cattle work was done with Mr. Sam Molsey that had Melrose at Winnip. He would call in at our place at Lyons to see if he could get one of the boys, which was me, to go and assist him the weekend or for holidays. I remember quite well going with him up to Winnip, to Melrose, and staying there, and daylight the next morning he set me off. He always had very good horses, very, very good horses, and a good horseman and stockman himself. I'd leave Melrose at daylight in the morning, Piccaninny dawn, on a good horse, leading another horse, heading for Mr. Molsey's coast country, where he had thousands of acres. Look, I could name a dozen different big paddocks, Hanlons and Bars and Canes and Skipworth, that he'd amassed over the years.
And what area was this exactly?
This was at Kentbrook, and in Hanlons there was an old hut, a rough hut, fireplace, that was about all, table and a couple of rough beds. I'd get down to the coast, which would have been 18 to 20 miles away from Melrose, and he'd come on the scene with a bit of food, and then we'd set out mustering, he on his chestnut horse, muster a lot of cattle, he'd take his cattle down for the winter, in the warm, that coast country is very warm in the winter time, in amongst the bushes, bring them back in the springtime, and they'd be shining, lovely. We would muster there for a couple of days, camp in the hut, live pretty hard, cold meat, mutton, and a bit of bread. And then we'd draft. I'd have to hold mobs together, stop them from galloping away, and he'd do the cutting out of the work, get on his horse and cut a particular beast out that he wanted to take home. He was taking heifers home, and as I remember, he drafted out about 200 joining heifers, Hereford heifers, beautiful cattle, horned Hereford, and we'd drive them out onto the main Nelson Road, and then he'd give me his horse to lead, and the cattle would string out home. They'd been driven down, and cattle can find their way home better than the man.
Used to attend the Merino sale, cattle sale, which was monthly. Well, no, that's not quite right. It wasn't a cattle sale, it was everything. They sold chooks and ferrets and vegetables and eggs. And the women used to go, we used to go there at, I think the sale started at 1 o'clock, and we used to get there at midday because the country women always put on a magnificent lunch. Sandwiches and pavlova, as much as you can eat. I think it was about 2 shillings they used to charge. And I went there this particular time, and there was not a big crowd there, but there was a few there, and they brought in the first. Of course, you can imagine what the merino sale yards were like. They were, I don't think the occupational health and safety crowd had passed them. But there was a very snorty bull that came in first. And he went around and round and round the ring and scattering people everywhere. And anyway, he finally broke through and jumped out and disappeared down the main street of Merino. So that was, I'd forgotten all about him. That was in. Went back to Mount Gambier, and the next month I came back, and here's the bull again. And they brought him in first again, and exactly the same thing, around and round and round, and he eventually broke out and down the main street. So I thought, well, you know, that's that, and went back to Mount Gambier. Didn't think of another thing from him. So the following month, I came back again. And here he was. They had him in. They put him in with 2 cows this time to try and steady him down. They thought that'd be a good idea. Well, they did steady him down a bit too. But the auctioneer was selling the bull, and he got to whatever price he made and knocked him down. And I think Len Allen bought him. I think, who was Keith Bullock's partner at the time, and he just knocked him down, and the bull reared up and dropped down, and he was dead as a stone. So that's the last we saw of him that time. Some lad from the crowd yelled out, "Well, we won't see him next sale."
Moving livestock by motor transport did not come into common practice until the late 1940s and early 50s.
The first livestock I saw carried on a truck was Jimmy Leone, Charlie McComb and Jack McCallum carting lambs from Wanderdale to the Coleraine railway station. It was a novelty, the carrying, because most of the lambs in that time were purchased on property, walked to the railway yards and walked. The main buyer was Borthwick's. The Wanderdale lambs, which they had 24,000 of, were trucked to Sims Cooper at Geelong by rail.
There were 2 trucks about here then, 2 trade trucks, and we'd be carting the cattle in to the sale from the night before and up till the sale time at dinner time. And then after the sale, we had a job to cart all the export cattle from the sale yards, 2 lots of sale yards, to the trucking yards, because the driving of them round the town, they lost too many in the backyards and everything else, and we used to cart them to the trucking yards, a shilling a head. 1 shilling a head, that's what. You'd just back into the yard, up the road, or these yards here, and fill it up, shut the door and go around. Well, then after the sale you'd count it, there was 20 for Smorgans and 50 for Keith Bullock, and that's what you paid on, a shilling a head for that.
At first, facilities for stock truck operators were primitive. Some farms even lacked loading ramps.
You used to have to take them to the next door neighbour, or drive them up the road to someone that had a ramp in those days. People bought cattle and they'd go out to their farms with them, and you'd have to get back into a drain or into a dam bank, or jump them out into the paddock, where you wouldn't be allowed to do it today. The RSPCA would be on you today. We used to carry chains to put on the tyres to get wheels to get into wet places, to get in and get out.
It's like so Mount Richmond and North Portland, we'd cart them to Mount Gambier, and there was no road from Mount Richmond to Nelson. We used to have to come back around this way to take them to Mount Gambier, and that would be an all-night job. Time we emptied the yards out there, and the ones that was bought by Mount Gambier Purchase, we'd be carting them over there all night. Bob Compton, Murray Moyle, And I think Sid Compton, there was at least 3 fellas anyway, would light a big fire and they'd sit there practically all night waiting for us to go to Mount Gambier and come back to load the next lot of cattle. They'd be sitting there waiting till we come back. If you stopped home and had breakfast or something, they'd be still waiting there to load the next lot of cattle.
Livestock were hard to move in those days because there were the transports were only smaller and there weren't many of them. And then, of course, that was the time that Alan Scott had just come to Mount Gambier. He worked himself, of course, he had an old 160 International with a 22 or 24 foot tray, semi-trailer tray. And that was regarded as a fairly big truck in those days. So you can see the difficulty that we had in moving stock.
Carting to Melbourne, in the busy time of the year, we used to do 2 trips in a day, only in petrol trucks, 6-cylinder or just a 345 V8 motor in. Big day, no sleep. Young and fit, you can do it. And in those days, no pills or anything like that, just your own ability to get through. Been without sleep for a couple of days, and the droughts and so forth. When we started, we used to have a card that you had to fill in. If we were working over hours, we just could discard the card and start another one and probably do Melbourne overnight.
For some years, rail and road transport competed and sometimes complemented each other. But given the versatility of motor trucks, the end for rail was inevitable.
The last rail trucks that I loaded out of Coleraine was in 1976, 144 trucks of sheep. The railways closed down livestock carrying about that time or very shortly afterwards.
Good working dogs were essential for the efficient movement of stock.
A good sheepdog was pretty to watch up over the backs, and even Fred Wilson, who was a very good cattle transporter, sheep transporter, and the Wilsons had really good truck dogs. They were another type of dog altogether. Sidney Wilson, Fred and those fellas, those dogs were worth, well, any amount, and no number of men could do what a good yard dog could do with sheep.
Yeah, I had marvellous dogs. You put a lot of work into them, but because you were transporting and working with sheep, virtually every day of the week, you had the ability to train good dogs because you were always working with them, and the training came naturally because you're handling stock every day and you trained up good dogs because that was the way it was. But, I had dogs, like Brian said, with the back sheep, and you'd go away in the middle of the night and be loading sheep at Narracourt or somewhere like that on your own, always on your own loading them, so the dog was invaluable. And then to run under the decks of into the cattle trucks or the sheep trucks, you needed a dog so as you could go in there and bring them out. You didn't have to crawl in there yourself to get the sheep out.
And with cattle, a good dog, different like a good paddock dog, you'd be able to put a good dog round cattle and stop him if he was getting them too stirred up and that sort of thing, and forcing dogs to get them into a yard.
Dudley Black had one and used to always come with us whenever we was going mustering. Dixie, he was a terrific dog. When you was going along the road, he could sense where there was a gate open, and he would go out around the cattle and go and sit in that gateway until the cattle went past. And then if you come to another bush track, in those days there was no roads in the bush at all, only wagons, and he would go and sit in that track to stop them from going that way. Lucky if you've seen him about from Mount Richmond to Hayward, you're lucky if you've seen Dixie about 3 times on the whole trip.
After sales anywhere near a town, well, that was a call for celebration, of course. Everybody, before my time I could peep through the door perhaps, but at the hotels, they'd gather at the hotels and have a good session, and of course drive home, perhaps with one eye shut, but that was before .05.
5 companies in Hayward and 12 salary agents with cars supplied, of course. And up until just recently, there was only one now, but I think there's a couple at the moment. But the times have certainly changed in the livestock industry in Hayward, or everywhere, I suppose.
Well, it was the nicest part of the job. What I liked about the stock agent's job was meeting people, going to places, way to places, to sales, visiting different properties and sale yards throughout Victoria and New South Wales. It was good fun, really. Head off early in the morning and go like a bat out of hell to Newmarket and put in a day at Newmarket and come back home at night. And you'd be ready to go somewhere again the next day. But that was good. That was a part of the life. Well, old Mr. Coastley, he never went anywhere without he bought a mob of sheep. Claude Skipworth, it was a real day out to take him somewhere. The entertainment you got while they was in the car with you and while they were there. Look, they just made it a day. I don't know whether Frank mentioned it or not. His father used to have a really good day out at the sale, talking to everybody. He was like Frank, I suppose, interested in the job, but he'd ask him, oh, well, yes, he'd go, and he'd have to take the day off to go. But a lot of fellas in this district that I had to deal with, they just looked forward to be rang up, would you come to a sale tomorrow, or perhaps the next day or two, and that was real entertainment to them, plus business. You know, they perhaps see something that they'd like to buy or just went for a look. Perhaps to get a value of their own stock. That's another thing that the travellers that did go with you like to see would have stock of their own and get an idea of values.
But they were good times, Frank.
Oh, great times. Like the punters and the dealers, it was more of a relaxed time. It was the thrill of the chase half the time. The punters would go away and, you know, they'd buy lots and lots of cattle. And even agents would go away and buy cattle on spec and bring them home because they knew that once they got them home, that somebody would take them, because once they saw the cattle and the price they were.
35.6, 36 pound, 7, 37 down below, I've got the bid, that 37 pound bid, 8, 38 pound 10, 38 pound 10, the bid's right out here in the place.